Welcome to the Return on Lifestyle podcast with Rey Descalso from Privada Wealth Management. In this podcast, we help you overcome financial worries and make sense of planning, investing, insurance, and banking. Join us for this journey as Rey draws from his expertise and interviews brilliant minds to help you enjoy life. The best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to Return on Lifestyle with Rey Descalso from Privada Wealth Management. Today we're going to be talking about the game of risk, and I don't think it's the board game with all the little plastic pieces that I love so much that took 12 hours to play, but we'll find out. Good morning, Rey. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for asking, sir.
All right, the game of risk, not the board game, right?
Not the board game. In fact, I don't think I have ever finished that game. I've often seen people start it and I just kind of walk away because, it's a great idea, but I just...
In theory.
Yeah.
It's probably fun in theory.
Yeah. Actually, I was talking with Barbara, our practice manager, and she was talking about they didn't have the internet over the weekend because a big storm came through. Oh. And they started getting out like the board games. She's like, it feels like work, Monopoly, Risk, whatever. It's like, come on, I just want to watch Netflix and chill. That's all we're supposed to do on the weekend. So, but today I'd like to talk about risk, not the board game, but actually something that it doesn't help you chill. Risk in the terms of when it comes to the risks that are in front of you, between you and your goals, typically retirement, typically estate planning, typically investment management. I want to talk about some of those things and in the game of risk and how many types of risk there are.
All right. How many types of risks are there?
Oh man, I'm glad you asked that question. Well, there's so many risks. We need a rim shot. Do you have a rim shot kind of sound effect? We'll work on that for.
How about that?
Thank you. Okay? Yeah, there's so many risks. So when we talk about risk tolerance, your advisor goes to you and says, "Hey, let's talk about your risk tolerance." What are we talking about? Well, typically, what we're talking about is how much volatility a client can withstand. Because our job is to get you from point A to point B and have you not cry uncle. And if your standard deviations of volatility are just too much, in other words, if you're down too far in your portfolio, then you're going to say, I'm out, I quit. And if you quit, you're not going to get to point B. The risk is just too much. You're going to get shaken off the roller coaster ride. So we try to get to know you. We try to answer questions. And here at Privada Wealth Management, we look beyond those questionnaires that ask you, questions and give you a descriptive qualitative term like, oh, you're conservative. Oh, you're moderate. Oh, you're growthy. You're aggressive. What does that even really mean? We use some specific software. We have you go through that software and we help for you to have a quantitative number so that we can take a look at the next 6 months and say, would you be comfortable of your $1 million or your $100,000 or your $10,000? Would you be comfortable being down this much, knowing that is the nature of investing? That is helping us to understand what I would call your risk tolerance, but let's give it a different name. Okay. It's your volatility risk tolerance. And the reason I'm giving it a different name is because there's more than just volatility when it comes to risk, right? Let me ask you a question. Do you drive a car?
Yes, I've driven cars before, and I own a couple. Yeah.
Oh, do you really? Okay, good. I'm glad that
so much easier than the horse.
It is. It is. I. You know what? That's a good point. Now, having said that, was it an option for you? Was it a choice whether you were able to insure your car?
Oh, by law, no, it wasn't a choice. I had to. I mean, I could always choose not to and break the law, but no, I had to, full insurance.
Right. It's a bad thing. And the reason for that is because, people know, or the government knows that it's just a bad idea to drive around uninsured, because when you try to go from point A to point B, there are a lot of risks, right? Well, when it comes to financial planning, to go from point A to point B, to get from where you are now to your retirement destination, your estate planning destination, whatever your goal is, there's more than just volatility risk. So when I drive my car, there are lots and lots of different types of risk. So when you get car owners insurance, what are you insured against? Well, you're insured against a lot of different things. You're not just insured for the mistakes that you make, right? You're also insured against the mistakes that other people make.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and what's interesting is when you go to your car insurance guy, they ask you, well, we actually can give you more coverage here to protect yourself against yourself, and we can also give you more coverage to protect you against uninsured motorists, because that might be an issue for you.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden you realize that your bill is growing, as you keep adding all these different bells and whistles. And then they ask you, well, Eric, how many people in your house are of a driving age? Because there's another risk, and that's the risk that they're going to take your car. Your teenage son's going to say, hey, you know what? Time to go drag racing on a Saturday night with your minivan.
Mm-hmm.
That could happen. And so there's a lot of things that your car insurance covers. Acts of God. So falling trees. All kinds of things are covered in your car owner's policy. Now, why am I saying this? It's because a lot of times when we talk about risk to our retirement, risk to our financial plan, we only talk about volatility. But I want to go through and let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of risk. And the reason this is important is actually because, in my opinion anyways, is because we have to figure out how much are these risks important to you. So I'd like this podcast to kind of be, as you're driving your car, listening to it possibly, or you're mowing your yard, or you're just sitting back and relaxing and listening to this podcast. I want you to do a little inventory, dear listener, about how important this is to you. And ask yourself, have I even ever been asked these questions before? So the next risk I want to talk about, we talked about volatility risk. Okay. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to our podcast called The Game of Risk. I'm sorry, not our podcast. This is the podcast. Go to our blog called The Game of Risk. And there's a little link that you can click there. And if you click that link, you can actually take our volatility risk software and take it for a dry run. But the next one I want to talk about is illiquidity risk. So illiquidity risk, and that's a term that I made up. Maybe I'll come up with a better term. But let me kind of ask you a couple questions. What I would ask my client or even prospective client is I would say, how many months of expenses do you have in your savings account? So I'll answer that question for myself. Right now, I know what my budget is. And I know what my budget is. And I say to myself, okay, I need $5,000 a month to run my household. So how many months of expenses do I have in my savings account? Now, right now, I have 6 months in my savings account, and I have an account, and that's the entire job of that account is simply to be my 6 months of savings set aside, right? Now, that $5,000, that is not me going out, for steak and lobster every night. All right. That's peanut butter and jelly. That's keep the lights on. That's cancel cable, right? I'm talking zombie apocalypse, basic, right? The basic budget. And that's 5,000. Do I spend more than that? Unfortunately, I do. Right. So you know what your monthly expenses are. They're oftentimes they waver from time to time, and you also know what you have to keep the lights on. And then you know how much you've got in the bank just in case something bad happened where the income dries up or you have an emergency. Now, my question then would be, would you like more than 6 months or whatever your number is, or would you like less? And answering that question helps me understand how comfortable you are with putting your cash to work for a long-term strategy, or better yet, how uncomfortable you are with illiquidity. Because you see, if you take some of that, I have people come to me like, you know what, Ray, I've got $100,000 in the bank and, it's just not working for me. Well, what's ended up happening is they have their illiquidity risk is low. They're like, I'm not worried about liquidity. It's not a thing for me. Now, is that wise? Well, that's the beauty of risk. We don't know. We don't know what the future holds. So if someone comes to me and say, hey, I'm aggressive. Is it wise to be aggressive? Sure. If we're in a raging bull market, it's great to be. But that's a forward-looking statement. So we obviously want to talk to folks when they come and they say, Ray, I got $100,000 and I want to put it to work in the market. So I say, okay, hold on a second here. And we ask the question, what is your monthly basic budget that you got to cover? And more importantly, it also goes too for people with high illiquidity risk. And this is an education that I want to have with folks because, I'll have people come to me where what ends up happening is they start drawing down their IRA. 65-year-old, for instance, comes in and says, well, we're going to start taking income from our IRA. Oh, okay. Gotcha. And we've also turned on Social Security a little early, but we went ahead and turned it on. Oh, okay. Gotcha. And so I asked them about their budget, and their budget is such that their IRA distribution and their Social Security distribution covers their budget with no problem at all. Right. And they've even got a little bit of wiggle room. And then I ask them, well, tell me a little bit about your portfolio. And they tell me about their portfolio. Well, tell me a little bit about your cash holdings, and I ask them the question, how you doing as far as your budget and how many months do you have? And come to find out, they've got sometimes 3 years of cash in the bank.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a problem there. Because ultimately, what they're doing when they turn on Social Security is they're starting a benefit that will no longer grow by deferring. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a bad thing. And then second bad thing is they started their IRA distributions, which are what when they come out of your IRA? Taxable. Yeah. So if they're taxable, you're actually not pulling out that $1,000. You're pulling out $1,000, and then you're also having some money withheld.
Mm-hmm.
And why are we paying that tax? Because the 3 years of savings that you got in the bank is not being taxed. And so we have a conversation. And oftentimes what I find is people have it's hard to give a right or wrong answer as far as how much. I see 6 months in my mind as sort of a rule of thumb, but we need to have this conversation because, the money that's in the bank has already been taxed. And your IRA at 65 years old can still grow until you're 70 and a half.
Yeah.
And so this, what you'll see then is you'll see folks that can oftentimes be on either side of that spectrum where they are just, cash is king. I lived through some tough times. I want to have lots and lots of cash always, on the sidelines, at the expense of other financial planning principles. Then the pendulum can swing where folks are paycheck to paycheck and they're willing to lock things up and they're willing to put things to work. And sometimes we got to talk them out of that. The key is understanding that balance and the balance that exists between liquidity and illiquidity, because even if you put something into just a non-qualified investment, you still now have taken liquid money that was pretty steady in the bank and you've put it into what? Volatility risk.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these trade off of each other, volatility and illiquidity. The other issue, too, on the other side of the spectrum for the couple with 3 years of money in the bank is another risk. So we covered volatility, right? We covered illiquidity. And then the next one, kind of a corollary, really, or a sort of the other side of the coin to illiquidity risk tolerance, in other words, the love of cash, is what? Well, let me ask you. Right now, as we're recording this in May of 2019, what kind of interest rate can you expect on the bank? All-time highs or all-time lows?
Oh, pretty low.
Pretty low, right. I think we're probably off the very lows, but it's not setting the world on fire. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, if your cash is there, what are we susceptible to? We're susceptible to inflation risk.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right. So we talked about volatility risk. Then we talk about illiquidity risk. So the next one I want to talk about is inflation risk. And as I mentioned, the problem with low interest cash holdings is the fact that you are losing purchasing power. And what's really insidious about inflation is it's kind of like that. It's imperceptible. Mm-hmm. I'm sure this hasn't happened to you, but a friend of mine on Facebook put pictures up of me when I was a senior in high school. And what's interesting, you're not going to believe this, but since, let's see here, and I'm 40, how old am I now? 45. So I must have been about, let's say 17, 18 years old. This may come as a shock to you, but I've put on a few pounds since high school.
What?
Yeah, I know.
No.
Well,
not you, Ray.
Right. Are you sitting down? I don't know if you're sitting. I should have probably warned you before. Yeah. So, and I what's interesting is I didn't realize not only have I put on a few pounds, but I've also had a few gray hairs, and there's something called gravity, and this gravity is having.
You're getting shorter, Ray?
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a whole other story. I tell people I'm 5'9", and I measure myself, and maybe it's because it wasn't a full moon, but I think I was like 5'8 3/4. So it's pretty depressing. But I don't know about you, but most people gain weight, probably like I have, and it's usually like 1 to 3 pounds a year. And you just, Thanksgiving comes and then it's January 1. You're like, yeah, this is the year. This is the year. I get it together. And it's imperceptible. And then you see these pictures of you 20, 30 years ago, and that 1 to 2 pounds kind of, taking its toll. It's natural to some degree. And it's also, it could be helped for sure. Well, the problem with inflation is that it is like frogs in hot water. We croak along and prices rise almost imperceptibly as our dollar buys less. And so when you were working, your income kept pace. But in retirement, your financial plan will have to keep pace. So in other words, your portfolio and your pension and your Social Security and the other things that you've got. And so one of the things that I have a little quiz question that I ask. And if you don't mind, I know we haven't rehearsed this ahead of time, and you might get this right, but here it is. So the question I would ask you if you were sitting here in front of me is, in the next 20 years, what is your prediction on the rise in the cost of living? Okay. My lifestyle will cost about the same in 20 years. Okay, that's A. B is today's dollar will buy about 75 cents worth of my lifestyle. Today's dollar will buy about, that's B. C is today's dollar will buy about 50 cents worth of my lifestyle. Or D, hyperinflation is a possibility and probable in the next 20 years. So A, we're good. Status quo. B, 75 cents on the dollar. C, 50 cents on the dollar. And D is, hey, hyperinflation. Don't have a number, but I know it's going to be bad.
I would go with B.
B.
That's where I would think, about 75 cents to the dollar. It's so hard to tell because, and this is what I was going to mention earlier when you were talking about this. I want to sidetrack your quiz show here, but when you look at gas prices, right? Gas prices have gone up and down and up and down. 5 years ago, they were really, really, really high. And now they're not even close to those prices. It's much lower. So that is a really hard thing to look at as inflation and that's where most people think of looking for inflation is the price of gas. But I just don't believe that that's a good thing because you look at that and you say, well, it's a lot lower than it was 5 years ago or 4 years ago, much lower. So everything should be good, but everything else has gone up. The price of renting, the price of homes, the price of groceries, and people just kind of use gas as a barometer, I think, in a lot of cases. But anyway, back to the quiz show. I'd say $75 to the dollar.
Wow.
Or 75 cents to the dollar.
Right. Well, so the question is that right or is that wrong? Well, we don't know. Do we? Mm-hmm. The reason and the reason I give you that 75 cents to a dollar is because that's about what has happened between 1999 and 2019. And my source is the CPI inflation calculator, and you can find that link in the blog that I spoke about, the source for that information. So according to this calculator, 1999 to the end of year 2019, we're looking at about a 2.14% average inflation. And that doesn't sound like that great. No big deal. But what it meant is that by 2019, things were 52.58% higher. And the math works out that 75 cents, your dollar is worth about 75 cents between 1999 and 2019. Mm-hmm. Now, am I right? Is that exactly what's going to happen going forward? No. We don't know. But the reason I ask you that question, Eric, is because I got to know where you stand. Because if inflation's a big deal for you, then let's plan on that. And I think it's important also too, from an educational standpoint, for folks to realize what you just said, and that is that stop talking about gas or computers. I'm using a monitor right now that cost me maybe $200, and it's like liquid cooled, and it has its own computer built in, and it probably makes smoothies. It has features I don't even know about.
I need to get one of those.
Right. So certain things are dropping in value, and that goes against the inflation numbers. But then what about medical expenses? Have those gone down? No. How about your insurance premiums between 55 and 65 as you're kind of waiting to retire? How's that treating you? And you mentioned gas. That's also open for inflation depending on what time frame we look at. So the luck of the draw, so to speak, is something that is we're looking at. And none of these are right or wrong. I don't know what volatility. I don't know what your liquidity needs in the future. I don't know what your inflation needs are in the future for sure, but we have to have that conversation. And more importantly, your advisor needs to take your temperature. Because if you came to me and said, hey, hyperinflation is a given, the end of the world is coming, that kind of thing, this is a conversation we need to have. Any kind of extreme thoughts, you might be right, by the way. Where's that coming from, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've talked about volatility. We talked about illiquidity, inflation. The longer you live, the worse inflation can get, as if it's compounding at 2% or whatever it happens to compound at. And actually living long is, for a financial planner, it's not a good thing, right? Let me ask you a couple questions about that. For you, Eric, do you have longevity in your family?
That's a good question. I don't know. It's a crapshoot because a lot of my father's side live quite long, but there's also a lot of there's been a lot of Alzheimer's and dementia on his side. So that's another thing that I think about and I consider. And then on my mother's side, there was a lot of cancer and heart disease and things like that. But at the same time, my grandfather and his father and most of my great uncles and things like that, they smoked like chimbeys and drank like fish. So,
right.
So that contributed to it. Now I don't smoke and I don't drink more than, a beer or two, maybe a week or every 2 weeks, depending on, what I'm doing at home or if I got friends over or whatever. So the lifestyle is different. So I know that healthcare helps us to live longer, but at the same time, I've got some things in the family tree that who knows, I may knock off at 80 or I may live to 95 or beyond. I have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's a good point. That's a good point. And oftentimes when people come to me, they're like, well, my dad died at 75 and my mom died at 74. So I think that's all the time I've got. Well, yeah, but tell me about, their life. Well, he
behaviors.
Right. He juggled asbestos and my mom, So obviously people lifestyle can wake up the bad genes. It's called epigenetics. And so those lifestyle choices that we make, or not even that we make, but that are foisted upon us can cause some things. Let me ask you another question that I like to ask, and that is, based on medical and technological advances, how many years do you think your life will be extended by had they not existed? Do you think it's going to make a difference or not a difference at all? So less than 10 years or over 10 years will be added to your life because of technology.
Wow, that's a great question, right? And seriously, we've never talked about this before, but because of technological advances, my grandfather lived an extra 16 years after a heart transplant, right?
Wow.
And that was fairly new, not new, I guess, but in the 80s, it was an earlier, recipient of a heart, and he got another 16 years out of it. So he would have been dead in weeks if they hadn't gotten that heart into him. So yeah, I could see technology extending my life a good 10 years easy.
That is cool. That is very, very cool. Yeah. What a great example that we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the fact that there are, and the thing about technology and medical advances, we're complaining about the inflation, of expenses, but let's complain about the fact that as from a financial planning standpoint, it's going to extend your life. And technology tends to double every 3 years, where the knowledge that we have feeds upon the knowledge that we had, and that feeds and feeds. So you look back 10 years ago at the phone you had in your pocket and the power that it had. And now Apple Watches, and I'm sure other things too. I don't have one. They can find 3 different types of heart arrhythmias. This is something that you and I can have right now that would have cost us a ton of money to go to our doctor. So we can go to the doctor and say, hey, you know what? I'm noticing that I'm getting this weird reading. They find out, they solve the problem before, you stroke out or you have a heart attack, in the front yard. So it's something we have to have that conversation, and everybody likes to talk about dying soon. Yeah, 85, I'm good. I'm worried that folks are underestimating their risk of longevity, but let's have that conversation. Let's take that temperature because, my daughter's 5 and I think that's, good chance that she's going to be on the plus 100 side. And I read an article that I can't find the source for it. I'll look for it, that these futurists, the people who study this kind of thing, believe that the person who's going to live to 150 has already been born. And if I can find that for you, I'll get it for you. But that just, that kind of should kind of wake you up for a second and think that someone amongst us on this planet right now is going to be old thanks to technology, thanks to right lifestyle choices, genetics. But nonetheless, where are we at? And we'll wrap it up with one more. And this is kind of my favorite one. And this is one that kind of gets everybody fired up a bit. And that is tax risk tolerance. Okay. So what is, dear Eric, you can take our quiz and you can also play along at home, dear listener. What is your current estimation of the national debt? Now, keep in mind, this was recorded in May of 2019. Would you say A, under $20 trillion, B, between $20 and $25 trillion, C, between $25 and $50 trillion, and D, including unfunded liabilities, over $50 trillion?
I'm going C, Alex.
Between
C.
25 and 50?
What is C? Yeah.
C is between 25 and 50.
No, I'm sorry. I'm phrasing it in the form of question. For Mr. Trebek.
I see. Thank you.
I'll choose.
We needed the music in the background. I'm sure that's copyrighted. Well, good. Well, the answer, this one actually has a correct answer. Well, it has two correct answers. Okay. And so the correct answer, if you go to usdebtclock.org, is 22 trillion and counting. So one correct answer would be B.
B. Yeah, B.
Now, the other correct answer, and that's kind of a debatable perhaps, and it depends who you talk to, is the final answer, D, including unfunded liabilities over 50 trillion. And what that means is Medicare, Social Security, as they are paying now, are going to cost us a fair bit to get my daughter completely funded, for her 120 years of life.
Yeah.
And the actuaries are looking at this, and the folks at the Congressional Budget Office are looking at this, and they're wringing their hands. In fact, you know what? Let me, before I go any further on that, based on the Congressional Budget Office report, when will Social Security benefits be reduced? A, never. The politicians wouldn't dare. B, between 2028 and 30. C, between 2024 and 2027. Or D, they already have been reduced through means testing and taxation.
That's a tricky question. I think it's a trick question, but I'm still going to go with C.
Between 24 and 2027. Well, that's a fair guess. The answer, according to the CBO, and again, that link is in the blog, is 2029. Okay, but you're right about it. It's always a trick question with me. Is there really a right answer when we're looking at the future? No, there isn't. There's what's our fear level of this particular risk. And then the other answer, D, is they already have been through means testing and taxation. That's really just me being a little snarky because there's something called provisional income. Okay. And we can talk about taxation. In fact, we're going to need to talk about all of these different risks in detail. But provisional income is how Social Security is taxed. And what that does is it takes things like municipal bonds and capital gains and counts it against you. So the bottom line is Social Security is taxed, whether it be 50% or 85% of it being taxed, depending on your bracket. And those brackets, that means testing called provisional income, is open for manipulation by our friends in Washington. So while the Congressional Budget Office said we're going to have to do something by 2029 because it'll be, it's a real deal breaker. Above and beyond that, I want people to be aware that Social Security is already, you paid into it, it was a tax, so to speak, and now they're going to tax it again, and they're able to do whatever they want going forward. And so I have these conversations with people, not to make them all sad, but just to be aware of the risks. Let's just know what's out there. And then let's create a plan fully informed about how we are beset on all sides. And, I would like to cover these topics more in detail and go over them and some of some of the things that can guide us going forward, and also go into the details of some of the high points that we talked about too for each of them. Because once you decide your goals and then you prioritize which risks keep you up at night, that's only then that we can get to work. Make sure that you have an informed perspective that has created these perceived tolerances for you, and then we can create a customized plan. And you'll know why we're doing what we're doing and why it's different than what the guy down the street from you is doing, because he's got different risk tolerances. And even if his goals are exactly the same, how we're going to get there is going to be different based upon the way you feel about the things that are out there that are standing in your way.
All right. Good stuff. I mean, we got a lot to talk about in the future. I also encourage anybody who's listening to this, if you have questions that have been brought up by this podcast or any of the other ones that you've listened to, this is Rey Descalso's podcast. However, I know Rey well enough. I can say that this podcast is yours as well, audience. So if you have questions, email them in, and Rey's going to give you an email address here in a second. Email some questions in, or maybe some topics and things that you want to hear Rey talk about or address, maybe with a guest or just maybe with me, but that you're interested in questions that you would love to have answered. So, Rey, what email address could they use if they want to email in some questions? Yeah.
Your team, YOUR team at Privada Wealth, PRIVADA Wealth.com. Love to hear from you, answer your questions, whether it be on the podcast or we can reach back out to you via email. Because, it's also important to note, you really need to not just take our word for it. We don't know you. We need to get to know you before this kind of information can be applied to your situation.
All right. Thank you, Ray, for your time today.
You bet.
And thank you all for listening to the Return on Lifestyle podcast with Rey Descalso. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Ray comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and family. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at Privada Wealth Management, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Return on Lifestyle podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Privada Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider for any questions you may have regarding your investment planning. The following program is sponsored by Privada Wealth Management, which is solely responsible for its content. Advisory services offered through J.W. Cole Advisors Incorporated. Securities offered through J.W. Cole Financial Incorporated. Member IFNRA, SIPC. Privada Wealth Management is an unaffiliated entity from J.W. Cole Advisors and J.W. Cole Financial. The opinions expressed by Rey Descalso should not be construed as specific investment, legal, or tax advice. All economic and performance information is historical and not indicative of future results. Investing may involve the risk of loss of principal. Any tax advice on this show is not intended to be used by any person for the purpose of avoiding U.S. federal or state tax penalties that may be imposed on such person, and each listener should seek advice from their tax advisor or legal counsel on topics that arise from the show. Nothing should be construed as solicitation of an offer to buy securities. The preceding program is sponsored by Privada Wealth Management, which is solely responsible for its content.